What if the most terrifying crimes don't begin with screams, but with silence? What if families can vanish without a struggle, without witnesses, without a single alarm being raised, and years pass before anyone realizes they were never meant to come back? This story is not about a killer who chased attention or left obvious trails. It's about patience, about planning, about a place so isolated that cruelty could unfold slowly, deliberately, and unseen. For more than a decade, pieces of this case existed in plain sight, misfiled, overlooked, dismissed as coincidence. By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late for many. What investigators would eventually uncover was not just a crime scene, but a system of control, deception, and calculated violence that relied on one simple assumption: that no one would connect the dots in time. This is the story of how silence protected a predator and how persistence finally broke it. In the summer of the mid-1980s, the San Francisco Bay Area is quietly turning into a place where people don't just go missing. They vanish in a way that feels impossible. No goodbye, no obvious suspects, no bodies, and almost no evidence that the victims ever walked out the door. Detectives are juggling separate disappearances that don't seem connected at first. A man who went to meet someone about a car, a family that stopped answering calls, and scattered reports that all sound like the same nightmare. Someone trusted a stranger, and then the trail went cold. The break doesn't come from a dramatic confession or a heroic chase. It comes from something small and almost ordinary: a shoplifting call at a lumber yard in South San Francisco. A patrol officer responds expecting the usual: an argument, a citation, maybe a quick arrest. Instead, the officer finds a car that feels wrong the moment he looks inside, a firearm that appears modified, and a driver whose story doesn't match the tension in his eyes. The man insists he's innocent, says the real shoplifter is someone else, and even offers a name. But nothing about the scene calms the officers. They impound the vehicle, take the man to the station, and start the routine process of figuring out who they're dealing with. Then the case swerves into the unreal. In custody, the suspect asks for paper and a pencil, as if he's going to explain everything. Minutes later, he collapses in a violent medical crisis. Paramedics rush him to a hospital, but it's too late. An autopsy reveals the cause: cyanide. He chose death over questions, meaning whatever he knew, he tried to seal it behind silence. But death doesn't erase evidence, it concentrates it. Investigators go back to the impounded car and run the details that matter: the engine number, the ownership history, the identity tied to the vehicle. That's when the case blossoms from strange arrest into something much bigger. Because the car belongs to a man who has been missing for months, suddenly one dead suspect is now linked to a real disappearance. Detectives search the vehicle with new eyes and find more reasons to worry: items that don't belong, clues that suggest violence, and signs that this car is not simply borrowed, it's a moving piece of a darker puzzle. At the same time, another detective is still haunted by an older case: an entire family, husband, wife, and baby, missing from an apartment where the scene doesn't look like a voluntary move. Their medicine is left behind. Their pets are still inside. The baby's room is disturbed. And the one thing that stands out like a beacon is that equipment rented out through a newspaper ad, video gear, disappeared the same time the family did. On paper, that's just property theft. In reality, it's a signature, a way into someone's home, a reason to open the door. Back at the dead suspect's trail, detectives locate a woman whose name appears on paperwork found in the car, an address connected to a remote cabin in rural Northern California. When they push toward that location, they sense resistance, delays, excuses, and attempt to control what they can see and when they can see it.
Even so, they secure a consent search of the cabin, careful not to spook anyone before they have legal authority. Inside, they notice details that set off alarms, strange modifications, odd holes, a room arrangement that feels more like containment than comfort. And then comes the moment that turns this into a major investigation. The detective recognizes equipment in the cabin that matches what was taken from the missing family. Serial numbers, make, model, the kind of detail a meticulous owner would record. That recognition is the spark. It means this cabin isn't just connected to one missing person. It may be connected to multiple missing people across months, possibly across the entire Bay Area. The people at the cabin panic and try to end the search, but now investigators have enough to do what they couldn't do before: get a warrant. When they return with legal authority, they expand beyond the cabin and focus on a cinderblock structure on the property, something described innocently as storage, maybe a shelter. When they open it, the tone changes instantly. Instead of tools, they find disturbing personal materials, photographs of young women, items that feel like trophies, writing that suggests fantasy turning into planning. Then the ground outside begins to speak. Investigators notice multiple burn sites, patches of ash and scorched earth that look intentional. They sift carefully, hoping they are wrong. They are not wrong. Bone fragments appear. Not animal. Human. A missing persons investigation becomes a homicide investigation in one sickening second. Now every inch of the property becomes a crime scene, and every object becomes a potential key to someone's identity. Buttons, jewelry, zippers, scraps of fabric, anything that can be matched to a family's memory. Search teams bring cadaver dogs, forensic specialists, and additional agencies. What emerges is not a single crime, but a system, a remote location, evidence of captivity, and signs that bodies were destroyed to prevent identification. Meanwhile, the dead suspect's known companion, named by the suspect himself before dying, becomes the living target. Police discover he has a history of running, of weapons, of slipping through cracks. A manhunt begins. Investigators search apartments, track travel routes, follow tips, and push the case beyond state lines. And while the search for him expands, the list of victims expands too. Men and women connected through nothing more than bad timing, everyday routines, and moments of trust, answering a door, meeting someone about a car, going to help a friend. The horror is not just what happened, it's how normal the entry point was. The case becomes a race between two timelines. The timeline of evidence, what the property reveals, what items can be identified, what remains can be matched, and the timeline of the fugitive, where he went, who helped him, how long he can disappear before he's forced to surface again. Because fugitives almost always surface for one reason: they still need money, food, shelter, and a chance to steal what they can't afford. And that's the terrible irony running through this story. The same petty theft that sparked the first police contact becomes the pressure point that can expose him again. As investigators prepare for the long fight ahead, an international extradition struggle, years of legal delays, and a trial built on painstaking circumstantial proof, they're also trying to do something heavier than arresting a suspect. They're trying to give names back to the missing, to explain the unexplained, to prove what happened even when the perpetrators tried to erase it with fire, distance, and silence. And through it all, one unsettling truth keeps repeating: this case didn't unravel because evil made a grand mistake. It unraveled because evil got careless for just a moment. One shoplifting call, one vehicle, one search that found something a detective couldn't forget. As the investigation deepens, law enforcement begins to understand that they are no longer dealing with isolated crimes but with a carefully constructed pattern that stretches across geography, time, and human behavior. The cabin in the mountains becomes the dark center of gravity for the case, a place where routine police work gives way to methodical excavation, forensic patience, and the slow realization that every object tells a story someone tried to destroy. Teams comb through the property inch by inch, documenting everything, knowing that in a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, precision will matter more than drama. They catalog survival gear, weapons, handwritten notes, photographs, and personal belongings that don't belong to the property's owner, each item potentially the last physical link between a missing person and the truth. What chills investigators most is not just the presence of violence, but the evidence of planning. Hidden compartments, reinforced structures, areas designed not for living but for control. A bunker-like structure on the property reveals itself to be something far more sinister than a shelter. Inside, investigators find signs that suggest captivity, confined spaces, restraints, and rules typed and posted as if meant to condition obedience. Damage to hinges and doors tells a silent story of resistance from inside, of someone pushing outward, trying desperately to escape. This isn't chaos, it's design. And design implies intent, repetition, and practice. Outside, the burn sites refuse to give up their secrets easily. Fire has erased faces, identities, and timelines, leaving behind fragments that force forensic teams to reconstruct lives from pieces smaller than memory. Anthropologists and medical examiners work together to determine age, gender, and cause of death where possible, but in many cases, certainty remains out of reach. Each fragment represents not just a victim, but a family waiting for answers that may never fully come. As evidence mounts, investigators expand their scope, reviewing missing persons reports across Northern California and beyond, looking for overlaps, newspaper ads, shared locations, similar methods of approach. Slowly, a grim list forms, linking people who had nothing in common except crossing paths with the same two men. While the physical investigation unfolds, the hunt for the surviving suspect intensifies. Tips place him in different cities, under different names, relying on a network of acquaintances and the anonymity of large urban spaces. Federal agencies are pulled in, borders become part of the map, and the case evolves into a multi-jurisdictional pursuit. Yet despite the scale, the fugitive remains elusive, always a step ahead, surviving by blending in, exploiting trust, and repeating the same low-level crimes that first brought attention to him. Investigators know this pattern won't hold forever. Eventually, desperation forces mistakes. And while police wait for that break, prosecutors quietly begin preparing for a legal battle they know will be unlike anything their small offices have faced before. They understand that even if the suspect is caught, proving guilt years later, without bodies for some victims, without eyewitnesses, with evidence scattered across time, will demand an almost impossible level of organization and resolve. This is no longer just a pursuit of a killer, it is a test of whether the justice system can reconstruct truth when those responsible did everything in their power to erase it. As weeks turn into months, the case grows heavier rather than clearer, and investigators begin to feel the strain that comes with pursuing a story designed to resist being told. Every new lead seems to open two more questions, and the absence of direct witnesses forces detectives to think backward, starting from what remains and reconstructing what must have happened. The surviving suspect's past comes under intense scrutiny, revealing a life shaped by evasion, resentment, and an unsettling comfort with violence. Records show earlier arrests, time spent in custody, and a pattern of disappearing just before consequences fully land. This history convinces investigators that if he is still alive, he will not surrender easily, and he will not stop unless he is physically stopped. Meanwhile, forensic work at the cabin continues to yield fragments of the truth in slow, agonizing pieces. Personal effects recovered from the soil are cleaned, photographed, and matched against missing persons reports, sometimes confirming long-held fears, other times creating new ones. Families are contacted cautiously, detectives choosing their words carefully, knowing that certainty is rare and closure even rarer. Some families finally receive confirmation that their loved one is gone. Others are left suspended in a cruel limbo, knowing something terrible happened but never learning exactly when or how. At the same time, investigators uncover videotapes hidden on the property, recordings that reveal not only the crimes themselves but the mindset behind them. Watching these tapes is emotionally devastating for seasoned detectives, forcing them to confront cruelty that feels calculated rather than impulsive. The recordings show intimidation, psychological control, and rehearsed dominance, confirming fears that the cabin was not an occasional crime scene but a place repeatedly used for captivity. These tapes become a critical piece of the case, offering proof where physical evidence is scarce, but they also raise new ethical and legal challenges about what can be shown, how it can be used, and how to protect the dignity of the victims even in death. As pressure mounts, law enforcement expands the manhunt beyond state borders. Witnesses recall sightings, acquaintances are interviewed, and travel records are examined. Gradually, a path emerges, one that leads north, across an international border, where jurisdiction becomes complicated and the rules of engagement change. Authorities realize that even if they locate the fugitive, bringing him back to face justice will not be simple. Extradition treaties, differing legal standards, and the possibility of capital punishment all threaten to delay or derail prosecution entirely. Still, investigators push forward, driven by a shared understanding that time is their enemy. Memories fade, evidence degrades, and witnesses disappear. The longer the suspect remains free, the harder it will be to hold him accountable. Yet amid the frustration, a grim confidence begins to form. Patterns like this rarely end quietly. Someone living on the run, carrying secrets this heavy, eventually slips. And when that moment comes, the entire weight of the investigation, years of work, thousands of hours, and countless unanswered questions, will converge on a single goal, making sure this story does not end in silence. As that grim confidence settles in, the investigation shifts from searching for answers to anticipating a mistake. Law enforcement agencies coordinate quietly, knowing that pressure, not speed, will break someone living on the run. Tips begin to surface, some vague, some contradictory, but a few feel different, sharper, more specific. Reports place the suspect moving through unfamiliar cities, avoiding routines, surviving on borrowed identities and temporary shelters. Each sighting reinforces the same conclusion: he is isolated, paranoid, and constantly calculating his next move. That state of mind makes him dangerous, but it also makes him predictable. People who believe they are smarter than the system often expose themselves through small, careless acts. A casual theft, a confrontation, a moment of overconfidence. Investigators know they don't need him to confess, they only need him to surface. That moment finally comes not through a dramatic chase, but through an ordinary incident, one that echoes the past too closely to ignore. A routine security call escalates unexpectedly. A suspect resists. A weapon appears. Within minutes, authorities realize they are no longer dealing with a petty crime, but with the very man they have been hunting for months. The arrest is chaotic, tense, and narrowly contained, but when it ends, there is no doubt left. The fugitive is in custody. For investigators who have lived with this case day and night, the capture brings relief, but not victory. Because catching him is only the beginning of the hardest phase yet. Legal reality sets in immediately. Jurisdiction becomes a battlefield of paperwork, hearings, and political limits. The suspect's location places him beyond the reach of simple arrest and transport. Extradition hearings loom, complicated by international law and the shadow of capital punishment back home. Prosecutors must now prove not just that the man is wanted, but that returning him serves justice rather than vengeance. Defense attorneys exploit every delay, every technicality, every procedural weakness, stretching time into a weapon of its own. Months turn into years as the case moves through courts instead of crime scenes. Meanwhile, investigators race against erosion. Evidence must be preserved, memories refreshed, witnesses protected. Some people who once held key information are no longer alive. Others struggle to recall details clearly after so much time has passed. Yet piece by piece, the narrative is rebuilt through documents, recordings, recovered items, and testimony that paints a picture too consistent to dismiss. What emerges is not a single crime, but a pattern, a methodical process of manipulation, captivity, and elimination carried out under the cover of isolation and secrecy. The cabin, once thought to be a retreat, is revealed as the center of something far darker, a place designed to erase people from the world. As the trial finally approaches, the weight of the case becomes undeniable. Boxes of evidence fill rooms. The cost climbs into the millions. Jurors are warned of what they may see and hear. Prosecutors prepare not just to argue facts, but to confront horror in a courtroom setting where emotion must be controlled and justice must remain precise. For the families of the victims, the process reopens wounds they never truly healed. For the investigators, It is the culmination of years spent chasing shadows. And at the center of it all sits the accused, no longer running, no longer hidden, but still silent. Whether that silence is guilt, defiance, or calculation no longer matters. The story that once resisted being told is now impossible to contain. What began as a series of disappearances has become a reckoning, not just for one man, but for every system that failed to stop him sooner. The question is no longer whether the truth will come out, but how much of it the world is prepared to face when it does. As the trial unfolds, the courtroom becomes a place where time collapses. Events separated by years are laid out side by side, stitched together through testimony, documents, and physical evidence. Prosecutors move carefully, knowing that this case is built less on eyewitnesses and more on patterns of behavior, movement, and control that repeat too consistently to be coincidence. Each witness adds weight, not through a single shocking statement, but through accumulation. A receipt here. A photograph there. A familiar object identified by a grieving relative. Individually, they seem small. Together, they form a structure that is difficult to escape. The defense responds by attacking gaps rather than facts. They emphasize the absence of bodies in some cases, question the reliability of informants, and argue that one man's words cannot substitute for physical proof. They remind the jury that certainty is required, not suspicion. It is a strategy designed to slow momentum, to introduce doubt where emotion threatens to overwhelm logic. At times, it works. Jurors appear unsettled, aware that they are being asked to judge not just actions, but intent, what was planned, what was known, and who was truly responsible. Then the evidence that cannot be easily argued away is presented. Recordings recovered from the property are described in careful, restrained language. The court limits what is shown, but even summaries are enough to change the atmosphere in the room. Control, humiliation, fear, these are not abstract concepts anymore. They are documented behaviors. Experts explain how such recordings reflect rehearsal rather than impulse, structure rather than chaos. This is not a man losing control, they argue, but one exercising it. As days turn into weeks, the emotional toll becomes visible. Jurors avoid eye contact during breaks. Attorneys grow sharper, more exhausted. Family members of the victims sit quietly, listening to names spoken aloud that had not been spoken publicly in years. For them, the trial is not about legal precedent or strategy. It is about recognition, the acknowledgement that what happened mattered, that the people who vanished were real and are not forgotten. When closing arguments arrive, both sides know the stakes. The prosecution does not ask the jury to imagine horror, they ask them to recognize consistency. To see how every delay, and deception serve the same purpose. The defense, in turn, urges restraint, warning against filling gaps with emotion rather than proof. The room grows silent as the jury is sent to deliberate. What happens next will take time. Days pass. Then more. Outside the courtroom, speculation grows, but inside the jury room, the process is slow and deliberate. Every decision must be unanimous. Every doubt must be addressed. This is not just a verdict, it is a judgment on years of investigation, on suffering that cannot be undone, and on whether the system, strained and imperfect, can still deliver justice when the truth is buried deep. And as the jury deliberates, one reality hangs over everything: no verdict can return what was taken. At best, it can draw a line under the story, not to erase it, but to say that it was seen, it was heard, and it will not disappear quietly into history. When the jury finally returns, the courtroom feels smaller, heavier, as if the air itself is waiting. Faces that have become familiar over weeks of testimony now avoid one another. No one speaks. The verdict is read slowly, each word landing with the weight of years behind it. Guilty counts are announced one by one, confirming what the evidence had been building toward all along. There is no dramatic reaction, no outburst, no relief that looks like victory. What follows is something quieter, a collective understanding that a line has been crossed, and there is no returning from it. For the families of the victims, the moment is complicated. Some feel a sense of validation, others only exhaustion. Justice, when it arrives this late, does not feel clean or complete. It confirms loss rather than erasing it. Names that once existed only in case files are now part of a permanent public record, attached to a legal conclusion that acknowledges their suffering. It is not closure, but it is recognition, and for many, that is all the system can offer. Sentencing brings its own gravity. The court weighs aggravating details, the scale of harm, and the calculated nature of the crimes. Words like intent, premeditation, and irreversible are used carefully, because they cannot be softened. The punishment handed down reflects not only what was proven, but what was prevented, the future harm that will never occur because this person will never be free again. The sentence is final, but the silence that follows is not relief. It is the sound of something ending without being resolved. Outside the courtroom, the case does not simply disappear. It becomes part of training manuals, investigative textbooks, and long discussions about missed warning signs. Law enforcement agencies study it for lessons: how long-term manipulation hides in plain sight, how evidence can exist without witnesses, and how systems must adapt when crimes are designed to leave no immediate trace. The investigation becomes a reference point, a reminder that patience and persistence, while slow, can still surface the truth. Public attention fades gradually, but the impact remains. Communities affected by the crimes carry forward a quiet awareness of how fragile normalcy can be. The cabin, once an isolated structure, becomes a symbol of what happens when isolation meets unchecked control. Eventually, it is dismantled, erased from the landscape, but not from memory. Physical places can be removed, the knowledge of what happened there cannot. Years later, the story is still told, not for shock, but for warning. It stands as proof that some crimes are not loud, not impulsive, not obvious. They are patient. They hide behind routine, legality, and delay. And they rely on the assumption that time will bury them. This case shows the opposite, that even when the truth is fragmented, delayed, and resisted, it can still be assembled. In the end, the story does not conclude with satisfaction. It concludes with responsibility, the responsibility to remember, to notice patterns early, and to understand that justice is often less about triumph and more about refusing to let silence win. Long after the courtrooms empty and headlines move on, the echoes of the case continue in quieter ways. Investigators who worked it carry the weight forward, not as trauma they speak about openly, but as instincts sharpened by experience. They learn to trust discomfort, to question coincidences, and to pay attention to what feels deliberately hidden rather than accidentally lost. This case becomes a benchmark in their careers, not because of its scale alone, but because it demonstrates how evil can operate patiently, without spectacle, relying on time and distance as shields. For them, the work never truly ends. Every future investigation is shaped by what this one taught them. For the families, time moves differently. Anniversaries arrive without warning. Ordinary moments, birthdays, holidays, empty chairs, carry the absence more loudly than any courtroom testimony ever could. Some families choose privacy, retreating from public memory, while others become advocates, pushing for reforms in missing person investigations and victim support. Their grief evolves, but it does not fade. It changes shape, settling into something carried rather than confronted. The verdict may have closed a legal chapter, but emotionally, the story remains unfinished. The broader public absorbs the case in fragments, through documentaries, articles, and retellings that struggle to balance truth with restraint. Each retelling risks turning suffering into spectacle, which is why the most responsible accounts focus not on sensational detail, but on patterns, failures, and lessons. The danger of stories like this is not that they are told, but that they are misunderstood. When reduced to shock value, they lose their warning. When examined carefully, they reveal how systems can be exploited and how vigilance, not fear, is the appropriate response. What lingers most is the understanding that justice is not a moment, but a process stretched across years. It depends on people who refuse to stop asking questions, even when answers come slowly or not at all. This case reminds us that some truths resist discovery not because they are unknowable, but because they demand patience, coordination, and moral resolve. Silence was the greatest weapon used against the victims, and persistence was the force that finally broke it. And so the story rests where it should, not as entertainment, not as legend, but as a record. A record of harm acknowledged, of responsibility enforced, and of a system pushed to its limits, and forced, eventually, to respond. As time settles over everything that followed, the case ultimately becomes something larger than the people involved in it. It becomes a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how easily darkness can exist alongside ordinary life without announcing itself. The investigation proved that even the most carefully hidden crimes leave impressions, on places, on people, and on systems, and that those impressions can be traced if someone is willing to look long enough. What brought this story to its conclusion was not a single breakthrough, but years of persistence, cooperation across borders, and a refusal to accept silence as an answer. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not undo the harm, but it ensured that the harm was named, recorded, and confronted. And in that acknowledgement lies the only ending stories like this can ever truly have, not peace, not closure, but accountability, and the hope that remembering prevents repetition. If you've stayed with this story until now, you're already part of a very small group, people who don't look away when things get uncomfortable, and who understand that real history isn't always easy to hear. Stories like this leave questions behind, and everyone walks away with a slightly different interpretation of what justice really means. Take a moment to think about what stood out to you most, what detail still lingers in your mind, or what you believe should have happened differently. Those reflections matter more than you might think. And if you value slow, carefully told stories that respect the truth rather than rushing to shock, then you already understand what we try to do here. This is Epoch Lens, where forgotten cases, hidden histories, and uncomfortable truths are examined with patience, depth, and purpose. We'll see you in the next story.
And the past is finally seen.